heritage buildings are beautiful masterpieces. And it's like, sure, they are. However, there's a huge realm of buildings that are not masterpieces, that are actually just as important to the history of our cities and are so often overlooked. We forget that their stories are never told.
I'm John Lewis, and you're listening to 360 Degree City, a podcast where we talk to people who are working to make cities better. Our hope is that after each episode, you'll start to see your own city from a slightly different angle. What are some special heritage buildings in your city? Do any spaces in particular reflect important aspects of your city's history? A lot of the time, people think of heritage as something that relates to history long ago, highlighting how cities were in previous centuries. Do events and buildings of 30 years ago even count as heritage? I find heritage to be a fascinating and, I'll admit, sometimes confusing topic. So today I wanted to talk to some folks who have a deep understanding of the matter. So much so that they publish a magazine to tell stories of urban heritage through stunning archival images.
Megan Faulkner. I'm a director at Donald Luxton and Associates. We're a heritage consulting firm in Vancouver. And I'm also co-founder of Hindsight Magazine.
And I am RJ McCulloch, and I am exactly the same. Also a director at Donald Luxton and Associates and the co-founder of Hindsight Magazine.
For the first 15 minutes of the conversation, RJ, Megan, and I discussed the meaning of heritage and how it relates to our values. After that, we dive into Hindsight Magazine, RJ and Megan's annual print publication. We recorded this interview just before the magazine was released. This latest issue of Hindsight looks at major events that transpired in 1989 and how they impacted the cities where they took place. The magazine takes you from Beijing to Berlin, stopping in Toronto, Paris, and San Francisco on the way. In our conversation, we talk about the key events that occurred in these cities back in 1989. So let's take a look back. How would you define heritage and, those characteristics that we might consider in our cities and our communities that are being historically significant or having heritage worth noting?
Heritage is a pretty difficult and very broad term to define, but at least what we understand as best practice today is recognizing those community values that hold some importance to different community groups, whether it is a tangible or intangible thing. It's something that defines and connects people to place and ensures that there's this lineage between how we experience our neighborhoods today and how we experience them historically. So it's maintaining that connection between the present and the past, and to ensure that we haven't forgotten where we've come from. That's sort of just how we view heritage, and it's broad, it's open-ended, but it's something that we try and keep pretty broad and open, just so we don't forget things. That's one of the maybe criticisms of sort of the earlier heritage planning efforts of the 70s and 80s, where it was very strictly defined and it was very architecturally based, and it was very European, quote unquote, pioneer settler based from here in the West Coast, the early 20th century mostly. And so we have this layer of heritage that is very, very closely defined as Edwardian era wood frame gated buildings built between 1900 and 1920, say. So in the past, 10 years or so, it's really broadened and opened up so that we actually look at heritage as a much greater field of intangible qualities from different community groups that have been traditionally underrepresented in how we view heritage planning. And so it's actually been really exciting the past number of years, where we're sort of realizing that, wow, we were quite myopic as a field, 30, 40 years ago, but we're trying to reconcile a few of those differences now.
Mm-hmm. And it feels like the public has more of an appetite for that definition of heritage also. I can remember when we first started working in the field, people would say, "That's heritage. What are you talking about? It was, wasn't built that long ago." But now we're seeing more recent places being recognized more formally. Like Vancouver Heritage Foundation does a Vancouver Special Heritage Tour, for example.
The Vancouver Special is a house style developed in the Vancouver area. The houses are two-story, box-like structures with low roofs and balconies on the front of the house. With a practical and cost-effective layout, they were built by the thousands between 1965 and 1985.
when a number of years ago people would have said, you're crazy, there's no value in Vancouver specials, they're just big ugly buildings, when there actually is a really interesting history to them, and people are starting to value them more, and it's becoming more recognized. So yeah, that's been one of the best things about the field, working in the field in the past few years.
And I can, having been involved in projects that have a heritage aspect to them, I certainly, you describing a certain mindset or a certain frame definitely resonates from the built perspective, but also typically who the heritage people in a community are. There's a particular demographic that is represented in that. So I can appreciate the shift in telling different stories and looking at different built forms and things like that. I'm curious, as that shift has happened, just really specifically, has the language changed at all? Because I'm just wondering, even as my understanding of heritage evolves over time, I still default back to your description, sort of the Edwardian style and those kinds of things. Has the language and how the conversation about heritage changed over time as this kind of scope of the field has changed?
Yeah, I think it definitely has. The big shift we've kind of defined as going from kind of architectural based, as RJ said, to values based. And so values based is talking about all the intangible values that contribute to a tangible place. So when we're dealing with, our day jobs or working on heritage buildings, they're tangible places. But we're not really talking all that much about tangible qualities. We're talking about intangible things. We're talking about what happened there, who the people were, what was happening in the neighborhood at the time. So I think the language has always been there, but it's used more to describe a tangible place than it was previously, when it was just, this is important because it's an example of this type of architecture. We're talking a lot more about the social history and the kind of stories around what was happening there at the time. So I'm not sure it's so much the definitions, but it's just the use of words that weren't really used before to describe a place.
Okay, because oftentimes you can think about physical form as a manifestation of values and ideals over time. So the distinction of what's valued in a community that's really dense versus a suburban, as one example. But we had a previous a guest, an old friend of mine actually, that he's Métis and he's an architect, and we were discussing issues around reconciliation and how. I framed it in a way I'd never thought of, the residential schools, the architects were the folks that executed a certain value set.
The politicians may have had the ideas of assimilation, but the people who drew the infrastructure for that to happen were the architects, acting with no personal agency. They were agents of the system.
As values change over time, particularly for really hard issues of how what we would see in the present day as really horrible values in the history, how do you address those issues and the shift away from certain value sets that are hopefully not, if not eradicated and not widely as held? How do you reconcile or hold on or tell those stories in a way through a community?
I think a lot of our recent efforts have been to invite those voices into the planning process. We don't feel the most comfortable, obviously, telling their stories because we didn't live this history, and it's not our story to tell. So we generally make the best effort we can to invite them into the process to make sure that they are able to tell the story in the way that they feel most comfortable with, and that they're able to have the most bandwidth to tell it. And so we try and hold that space for them and get them to use their own voice to tell their own story, instead of us sort of just telling it the best we can, knowing that it's not our story to tell. We do, there are occasions where the voices aren't, comfortable with the process or aren't able to make it into the planning scheme, in which then we do have to do our best to, based on our knowledge of history, to just tell it the best we can. But with the reconciliation effort, it does touch us in certain ways as well. And it's challenging, frankly. It's very challenging because, again, it's not, we don't have the best understanding of it because it's not our history, but, and there's so much to learn. There's so much to understand, and it's a very difficult topic, but, it's part of our community history as not just a city, province, country, but has to be told. So there's a huge learning curve that we're kind of still looking upwards toward, but we're trying to turn the ship and recognize that it's history, at least in Vancouver and BC, didn't start in the late 1800s, and there was nothing. There's it's starting with that simple recognition actually opens up a whole different world of thinking about how we prepare documentation, because a lot of it, still based on the rules from the national authorities, kind of just have this prescription where it says this building started at this date. You don't really go back further than that. So it's having to introduce that extra layer of history. It's like, there actually was a lot going on before this.
And the municipalities themselves have come a long way in the last few years as well. It used to be kind of a discussion between the city, the architect, and the planner, whether it's a consultant or planner with the city. And that's not the way it is anymore. It's a lot more of a collaborative process. There's a lot more engagement at various levels, especially when the projects get larger, where there are a lot of different voices and a lot of different stories being told, and a lot of different, they're open to interpreting things a different way. And I find that the community and the city alike are looking for new ways to tell those stories, because that's really what heritage planning is. We're just storytelling. And it doesn't do anyone any good to wash over painful things. There are a lot of great examples all over the world of very painful places that have been recognized and preserved, because it's not just about, the good things that happened. It's remembering the painful things that happened as well. And sometimes that means keeping the physical place, and sometimes it means getting rid of the physical place and interpreting what happened. It all depends on the people who it affects the most. And I feel like heritage planning has really, we're coming to grips with that, and we're trying to find new ways to tell those stories. So it's ever evolving, which makes it complex and challenging, but also really rewarding as well.
Yeah, I bet. And it by how you describe the work that you do, it really sounds like two important qualities of a heritage planner would be obviously curiosity and then humility, particularly as you're trying to integrate other voices that aren't yours into the stories that you're weaving.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate.
Exactly. It's very easy to find yourself in a silo and become a historian for a very specific topic. And we actually come up against that a lot with certain approval processes where it's, someone knows a lot about a very certain strain of history, and that's really wonderful that they know that. But then, then there needs to be that conversation about, yes, there needs to be a little more open-mindedness around other facets of history. So, it's that humility factor is something that, again, it's coming to light much more the past few years, which is refreshing. But traditionally, it was very much, in a similar vein to only architecturally stunning buildings from the early 20th century are important. So now we're like, oh, right, actually, there's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of what's really inspired us to start the magazine. Actually, it was kind of a retaliation against the traditional fine grain heritage buildings are beautiful masterpieces. And it's like, sure, they are. However, there's a huge realm of buildings that are not masterpieces that are actually just as important to the history of our cities and are so often overlooked we forget that their stories are never told. So, it's just, it's something that we've been exploring through the magazine, where it's kind of like those uglier facets of our history. They're not so pretty. We started with the viaducts in Vancouver, and that was a very controversial decision to remove them whenever that's going to happen. But we kind of took the counter argument that we don't think the viaducts should stay because they transport cars from point A to point B. That's not exactly good for the city's history. However, they're the only tangible representation of the freeway fights that happened in Vancouver in the 70s. And if we lose those, are we going to forget that we had this freeway fight and that we became a 100% different city than we were going to be starting in the 60s and 70s? We did a little advocacy there, saying like, well, we're literally tearing down our history in front of our eyes, and I don't know if that's a benefit. It's a benefit from removing an quote unquote eyesore. However, it is, once again, it's washing over an indeed painful part of our history in a very different sense of painful. However, it's something that deserves a second look instead of just the traditionally held value of planning, which is, get rid of any sort of car infrastructure, which again, from a transit perspective, we agree with. However, it's, there's the heritage factor comes in, and it's always complicates things. And, that's just part of the interest and curiosity around what we do.
Yeah.
So with the magazine, so you're fully employed professionals with day jobs, and you just decide to start another magazine in your free time. I think your story about the viaducts tells me a lot, but can you maybe talk about that process of broadly about why you decided to start Hindsight, and what have been some of the most interesting or inspiring aspects of that secondary project, in addition to all the other things you do?
So our day jobs we're very lucky, and our work is really fascinating. Some of the best aspects of our day jobs is when we start a project, and someone might come to us and say, I have a heritage house, or I have an old house, and I want to put an infill in the back, for example. And so our work starts with, okay, let's look into the history of this house and collect what we call the tombstone data. So, when was it built? Who built it? What was going on in the neighborhood at the time? And one of the best ways to figure out what was going on is to look through the archival images of that time period. And so we would start digging into the Vancouver archives, looking at old photos. And in our searches, we would come across the most stunning images. Just, Vancouver, we're really lucky here. The City of Vancouver Archives has high-res digitized photos that are completely accessible and really easy to find. And we would come across images that just, tell you such a story about what was happening at that moment. And we were just thinking, we're kind of hemmed in our day jobs looking at a specific place, but how could we open it up and share these images with other people? They're really accessible, but no one knows that they're there. So we wanted an opportunity to show people what we were coming across every day and tell those stories. And so it kind of started out as looking at Vancouver. As RJ said, we were actually doing a project in the Chinatown area at the time, and we were trying to find a photo of a specific building. And we kept coming across all these images of the viaducts under construction. And they were just photos that an engineer had taken and documented every single aspect of its construction. There's so many photos, and they weren't meant to be beautiful. They were just meant to document what was happening. But we kept coming across them and looking at them, and they just showed such an interesting kind of raw, beautiful, some might say, look of the city, and that you wouldn't go looking for, that you wouldn't normally see. And so we thought that, maybe we could actually look outside of just Vancouver and instead start looking at themes that different cities share. So the Vancouver Viaducts issue came about because of this discussion of what to do with this raised infrastructure. And we realized, a lot of cities have dealt with this. A lot of cities had raised infrastructure that came about in the 60s and 70s, or raised rail beds that came about in the early 1900s. And what did they decide to do with them? What are they doing with them now? But I guess as an overarching view, Hindsight developed because we just want to connect people to place. We want to tell stories. We want to do it through amazing photos. We want to encourage a dialogue about not just about heritage, but about how things repeat and what we learn about past events and how it impacts how our cities are built, and have that discussion around the way our cities are changing and whether it be for the better or not. So we thought doing kind of thematic views would be a really interesting way to discuss kind of interesting, timely topics.
Mm-hmm. That's super inspiring, and it rings a bit of a bell of why we're having this conversation on this podcast. We similarly we were had a variety of different kinds of conversations in our day jobs, and thought, well, that would be good if we could explore even more issues and aspects of cities and share that with more people. So we got some alignment here. This is great. So you have an upcoming issue, if I understand correctly, so honing in on a specific year of 1989. So you focus on events that occurred in 5 cities, Beijing, Toronto, Berlin, Paris, and San Francisco. Can you maybe share what events occurred in these places in 1989 and why that was a unique year that you felt you wanted to focus on?
Sure. We I guess the date itself kind of presented itself in an interesting way, because we'd been looking at our issue 3 was on postmodernism. So we were looking at a lot of 1980s architecture, which some hate, and I've actually come to love now because it was just so wild and yeah, it's wild and wonderful. But so a lot of photos from the 80s were coming up, and when we were writing our postmodern issue, there were a lot of political implications that led to postmodernism developing the way it did. And we realized that, even in our first issue, when we were looking at urban infrastructure, those events that led to those raised highways being built in the 60s and 70s, they were tied by politics, but also by time. So we were thinking, instead of looking at just one topic, what if we looked at one date and looked at how it connected events across the world? And so there's some of our events in these cities that we focus on are connected, and some of them were, happened because of natural disaster. But yeah, we thought it was kind of an interesting take on the magazine, was to look at a date instead of an issue, and see what was happening in the world at that time.
And then, are there any key themes that connect these events across these cities?
There's certainly a political theme between them. There's a lot of democratic movements, if you will. We look at the Tiananmen protests in Beijing, but we also look at the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so months apart, worlds apart, but, similar kind of winds of change, very different outcomes, obviously. But we recognize that now that it's been 30 years since this has happened, it's, if we generally recognize 30 years as a generation, we think it's a great time to be looking back and saying, okay, what have we learned? Have we learned? And, they're actually, based on current events, say in Hong Kong, I don't know if all of the world has learned from these somewhat recent events. But again, now that it's been 30 years, it's okay, maybe we need to really take stock of what happened and what lessons are there.
And we're still talking about building walls in 2019, right?
So it's right. History tends to repeat itself. I guess that's why we'll be forever employed, but we'll see.
Smart career.
Yeah, one of the most interesting, so obviously when we're talking about Beijing, we're talking about, we do talk about Tiananmen specifically, but the protests were happening across Beijing and also across 400 other cities in China.
In China, the will of the people has been thwarted by the will of the people's government. It was late at night in Beijing, this morning our time, when a divided leadership of the Communist Party finally decided it had had enough.
The People's Army came face to face with the Chinese people and was stopped in its tracks. The protesters sang patriotic songs and chanted slogans for freedom and democracy.
But some of the most interesting things we've come across was that people were asking for political change in China, and they didn't get it. Some say that China's actually become tighter and more restrictive on its people, but so it's failed to stimulate that major political change. But the images that came out of what happened in Beijing in 1989 were really impactful on the rest of the world. So, someone in China today who may not have been born in 1989, were they to be shown the Tank Man photo that's become so famous? It's, one of the most powerful images of the 20th century. They may not recognize it. They may not know what happened. But other parts of the world, those images were really powerful. And it's been argued that what happened in Beijing actually helped to precipitate the revolutions of 1989 in Eastern Europe. So there was that impact. And, Tiananmen is the largest public space in the world. It holds 1 million people. It's immense. And though the changes in Beijing following the massacre there weren't as tangible as they were in other cities, that place holds, it's incredibly significant because of its ancient history, but because of its modern history, and not just to people in China, but to everyone else. I went there in 2002 or 3, I guess. And, it's an incredible feeling to stand there. It's just the scale of it is so massive. And so, it's not something I was used to, especially coming from small town Alberta. It was just like, it blew my mind. But then also coming there with the knowledge of what had happened, that's very powerful. And we thought that Beijing would be a really interesting city to look at in 1989. That was such a huge event and such a well-known event across the world. And we sadly couldn't find any available photos that we could use from 1989, specifically in Beijing, but the photos that we did come across are so stunning from the 80s and, I guess mid-80s, early 80s, that are just candid shots of the city and of the people. And so that was a really fascinating one.
A little bit haunting, too, to look at them and realize that just a few years later, this horrible event would happen. But again, that's the whole point of our magazine, is to sort of provide a bit more context around these events that are generally well known, but there's maybe not a lot of imagery around, or just, just that extra bit of historic context that sort of shapes your understanding of a time and a place. And I think it's been, we inspire ourselves constantly with every different issue, which is like, oh my gosh, I wish we could do this all day, every day, but alas, bills and such,
Life gets in the way.
Yes.
So what was happening in Toronto in 1989 that was worth delving into?
That was the year that Skydome opened.
Tonight, we are going to celebrate. It is the opening of the world's first multi-purpose, state-of-the-art dome stadium with a fully retractable roof. Join us. We're on our way to the opening night celebration at the Skydome.
And we think most Canadians probably know what Skydome is. If not, we shall find out. We actually were interested to learn about it because, as we understood, it was sort of a precipitator to more of their lakefront development. And as we have mentioned, when we started looking at the Gardener in our first issue, we sort of realized that Toronto has always and continues to work on their lakefront access issues. And, you know, they have a long way to go, but it keeps it interesting for sure over there. But we saw Skydome opening, and that was sort of, after the CN Tower, one of the major implications to show that there was a future in Toronto beyond its industrial, transport-oriented lakefront. And while there's a big argument, Jane Jacobs made it probably the best, saying how convention centers, stadiums, buildings like this are ultimately city killers because they're large scale. They just drain street life. They're not exactly good building blocks for a city. But in this case, we see that actually maybe it was a pretty good indication of what Toronto could be, because it sort of precipitated the development that happened called City Place, which is still being built around the area. And it's, you know, sometimes you need to make these bigger grand gestures to actually get people to understand that there is a future neighborhood, that there is, again, that alternative where it's not exactly readily available, because it was a wasteland up until the 70s, 80s. And then now it's a high-rise neighborhood. It's certainly been argued that high-rise neighborhood has some issues in and of itself. But again, is it better to have that or, you know, fallow land that's not doing anything for anyone?
For sure.
So,
for sure.
You know, it's kind of an interesting thing. We also look at, in Skydome's history, the whole idea of publicly funded stadiums and other large-scale buildings like that, and saying, well, again, generally these turn out to be total boondoggles that are just public nightmares, because the budgets go from, you know, 100 million to 2 billion in 2 months, and then it's just like, why did we sign up for this? But again, sometimes it actually turns out pretty well. Skydome, I think, is a good indication or a good example of how you actually build a city around it and not just sort of plunk it down somewhere surrounded by a sea of parking lots and say, like, great, we're done, moving on. And, you know, then it eventually in 25 years is too old to be the flashiest, fanciest stadium, doesn't get those corporate contracts, and then it just, you know, eventually has to get demolished. And it's we see that time and time again in the U.S. especially. But it seems like Skydome might have a bit more staying power, hopefully.
Yeah, it's interesting. On a personal note, next year will mark the completion of a multi-year project with a planner friend of mine to see every Major League Baseball park, and so we've and I used to go to school in Toronto. I've been there a bunch of times to the Skydome, but it's interesting to observe the evolution of baseball stadiums in particular, where you have the Wrigley Fields and the Fenways that are in the fabric of a community built in 1914, 1918, how it moves then to the giant stadium with the parking lot, that most of them are gone, and then how it kind of came full circle. Like Skydome was the first of kind of new era ballparks, but it's kind of like in between the big massive thing that stands on its own or being integrated into the fabric of a city. It definitely is a marker. And then when Baltimore built their stadium, that marked a new stage of evolution where they're really quite thoughtful in terms of how do we integrate this into the fabric of a city without being this boondoggle from an urban life perspective. And then we'll see where it all evolves, because the latest stadium in the major leagues was Atlanta. I think that was 2 years ago, and they're way the hell out in the suburbs, and they've built a town center around it, but it's not in the central part of the city. So it's been really interesting I'm actually a pretty passive baseball fan. I just like going to baseball games and having beer and hanging out. But it's from an urban nerd perspective, it's been really interesting to see how these places fit. And Skydome is a bit of an anomaly because it kind of sits in between eras of urban development.
Yeah, I mean, we think it's aged quite gracefully as well. I mean, when you look at it from the outside, it doesn't exactly look like it's 30 years old already. And it's just, the technology was quite advanced for the day. And it's just, it's, we hope it sticks around for a while because, enough money was spent on it. And, it's just...
And it's become a landmark.
Yeah, exactly. The fact that we still call it Skydome and not Rogers Place, I think, is also very telling.
I know. That's an important distinction I make with people who call it that. I say, don't you mean Skydome?
I don't think anyone's really keen to call it Rogers.
Exactly. Yeah. And personally, again, it'll always hold a special place. I hope it's there forever because I saw my beloved Saskatchewan Roughriders win a Grey Cup there. So it's all good for me. Okay, so you touched on Berlin, and I think that's obviously 1989 in Berlin is a pretty well-known monumental year for that city and that part of the world.
These are the sights and sounds of the continuing celebration of Germans about the symbolic tearing down of the Berlin Wall.
What about Paris and then San Francisco? What was going on in those cities that really drew you?
Paris was really interesting. We actually just touched on it on our first issue, not knowing that we would do it here in issue 4. But was the President Mitterrand instituted a project called the Grand Projet, which was just this big architectural campaign of building these huge public works that would sort of redefine the face of Paris and sort of, in his mind, bring France back to greatness. And it was certainly a lofty goal there. But his view was that through these wonderful architectural projects that Paris would sort of shine brightly again. And that, after most cities in the 60s and 70s suffered through some challenges, whether it was suburbanization or just a lack of investment. So, I mean, it seemed like it was coming at a good time to reinvigorate the urban landscape of Paris. And so 8 architectural commissions were a part of the program, even though a few of them were started with his predecessor. He doesn't exactly make that clear, but it's pretty clear in the history books now.
Funny how that works.
Yeah, interesting how it sort of becomes the...
This was my idea.
Yeah, well, this was always my idea, even though it was already under construction. We see the Louvre Pyramid is probably the most well-known project that came about with this program, and I am designing that in the early 80s and finally completed in 89.
So the Louvre Pyramid was completed in 1989 to mark the bicentennial of the French Revolution of 1789. It was designed by Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei and commissioned by the then French president François Mitterrand.
This was a hugely controversial project, and it was really, really maligned most Parisians' view of outside architects and said, what are you doing to our beloved Louvre? I cannot believe you're just positing this horribly contemporary glassy thing in the middle of this grand court. And, it took a while for Parisians to kind of change their attitude and recognize that, okay, this is actually kind of nice, and it's been 30 years. It's not like it's gone away, so I guess it's about time to recognize, it's not such a bad addition. But it was, interesting just to read about how Mitterrand really wanted something to be memorable, to be a landmark, and he essentially self-selected I.M. Pei and said, you do it. You're good at this, And, again, the Parisians, architectural critics, a lot of people were just saying, I cannot believe you're doing this. But then we look again, we looked at postmodernism in issue 3, this political era of, it was a really interesting time in the 80s when you're kind of moving away from that traditional mindset of modernism as was understood through the whole post-war era to this sort of, more futuristic outlook where it was glassy, flashy, not traditional in any sense of the word and sort of, pushing the envelope essentially. And so we wouldn't call the Louvre Pyramid postmodern. We would just call it, I think, contemporary. But it is such a grand gesture that, if you've been to the Louvre, you'll always remember that was there. And again, just like Skydome, it's it doesn't exactly look 30 years old. It's aged pretty well. And some of the other projects, there's the Grand Arch in La Défense, which is sort of a contemporary iteration of the Arc de Triomphe. And again, kind of not so understood. Like, why did you build another arch in the, almost suburban part of the city? And there's a lot of reasons why. There's the Danish architect had to resign, and it's just, there's all these, you could write a book. There have been books written on this. In fact, this whole architectural program. But, we kind of had to go up to a higher level and recognize that world leaders have been doing this for a very long time. I mean, even in Paris, you look at Napoleon and his monuments, and it's just, it's this legacy building campaign of governments. And it's just, this has been going on forever. This is kind of just an interesting way to look at, like, oh, this was still going on in the 80s, really? Wow. And it's like, I can't believe we spent so much public money doing this, which is essentially just to make sure that Mitterrand was never forgotten, and, but what was actually produced through that program, they're really great spaces. They're good urban city building spaces that ultimately did contribute to the public sphere of Paris. And again, they've almost all aged quite gracefully, and they're quite lovely. And is it such a bad thing that we kind of spent a lot of money on someone's vanity project? I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's your when you talk about the complexity of your work and then the complexity of city building and just to be able to hold potentially two things in tension, but they may not be mutually exclusive at the end of the day. So if someone has a really big ego and they want to push something forward, if you can steer it in the right direction, that it has a long-term public benefit, then it's something to be leveraged.
Exactly. That's what we think hopefully happened in Paris. We, obviously not living there, don't know the true reaction to this, but from the outside looking in, we say our viewpoint is like, you didn't do so bad, all things considered. So.
And from a heritage planning perspective, like, best practice now is when you're making contemporary additions to a historic building, is you want to make the addition compatible with, distinguishable from, and subordinate to the historic building. And I think that IMP's pyramid is actually, he did a really good job. Yeah. It works well, but I'm sure there are some Parisians who would disagree still, but
I'm sure.
Well, that level, the 3-point criteria, I've never heard it articulated that way. That's super helpful for, just even conversations I have either professionally in our engagement practice or just with grumpy relatives or whatever that just basically are like, well, it doesn't look exactly the same as the building that it came from. So it's a failure.
That's our biggest defense when it comes to what we call faux heritage, which is just building houses mainly that, are replicas of what was happening at the time its neighbors were built, which, we want our historic buildings to be authentic. We want to be able to walk down the street and be able to tell what's old, what's new. Because they're records of their time. They're reflective of when they were built. And it's important, even if you don't know anything about architecture or about heritage, to be able to walk down a street and kind of identify, what was happening in the city at that time, because the architecture reflects it. And so, we like to use those 3 points from the standards and guidelines to defend contemporary additions, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And then the last city in your 1989 edition, I am guessing that this is related to some natural events rather than political.
Yeah. So the earthquake in San Francisco in October of 1989.
Now our power has been off for almost 15 minutes, and the reason, if you do not know by now, was a major earthquake, an earthquake which was felt from Oakland to Sacramento, as far south as Los Angeles. We have reports of major power outages in San Francisco and reports throughout the Bay Area. There's also major damage in San Benito County.
It was devastating, and some of the biggest effects around the Embarcadero Freeway. And San Francisco is really interesting, as most people know, had a devastating earthquake in 1906 as well. One of the interesting things that we came across in our research was that a year previous, 1905, the city had hired an architect to do a municipal plan for them. And it basically involved redesigning the streets and the city to make it more beautiful, more scenic. And then this earthquake occurred, and a lot of people were killed, and a lot of buildings came down. And instead of kind of going full tilt and using that new plan, the city chose speed over beauty, basically, and decided just to build the city back up in the same place it had been, specifically the downtown, like just build things up as quickly as possible because they didn't want to lose pace with what was happening in other parts of the West Coast. They didn't want LA to catch up to them. San Francisco was a huge center at that time. And so they just said, let's just go for it. Let's just build as quickly as we can and get back in business. So in 1989, when the earthquake struck, it kind of gave the city the opportunity to change some of the things that had happened. They didn't make that decision in 1906, but they did make it in 1989. So this freeway had long been an eyesore in the city, and it was originally supposed to be a lot longer than it was, but because of the freeway rebellions in the 1950s, it was actually cut short. So it was just kind of, they called this little stub freeway, double-decker freeway. And so it was severely damaged and closed. And so advocates for its removal started voicing their concerns again, that it should be removed and that a surface road should be put in its place. But what's interesting now is when you read articles about it, it's like, oh yeah, that was a no-brainer. Tear it down, put this surface road in with streetcars and plant it with palm trees, which is what ended up happening. But when you go back to the record of the time, to the newspapers that were coming out in October and November of 1989, the community was really strongly advocating for them to be either fixed or torn down and replaced exactly as they were, because there was a lot of concern about losing business from all the traffic that was coming in, specifically to Chinatown at the time. And they were bringing up this vote that had happened in 1986, where I think the mayor at the time had a cake constructed, a 64-foot long cake or something of the Embarcadero Freeway, and she smashed it with a mallet to show how much she hated the freeway. And there was a lot of support for that action. So they said, let's take this vote to the people in 1986. Let's decide if we're going to raise this freeway or not. And they were shocked that the community voted 2-1 to keep it. And they thought, oh, that's, it's not what they were expecting at all. And it turns out that it came out of this fear of a loss of business, but also skyrocketing property values, and they were worried that there was some collusion going on with environmentalists and downtown property owners. And so the story around it is actually a lot more interesting than kind of the surface level research would indicate. But fortunately, they did decide to remove it, and now that area of San Francisco is incredible. The views of the waterfront aren't blocked anymore, which a lot of people say is a cardinal sin in San Francisco. Don't block the views of the water. So why would they put a double-decker freeway there in the first place? But so the result is that they were kind of given a second chance to change what had happened, what they had built in the 60s and 70s as a result of the earthquake.
Huh. I think it's well, I know it was the same earthquake, but I think it was called the Central Freeway, also vanished as a result of the earthquake, and an area called Hayes Valley, which have been around. It's kind of emerged and was revitalized as a result. And I was there. This is now 6-7 years ago, and there was still elements of it, like the off ramp was still there. It was slated for development, but they had turned that space into kind of like an urban farm for the temporary use, which was really cool. And but again, Like that was in 2013 or something like that, and the earthquake was in 1989. And just the when you're in the city building business, your concepts of time are very warped compared to the rest of the world.
And I know there was a lot of that actually came up back in I think it took a year for them to decide to tear down the freeway, and then a while longer to decide that they weren't going to rebuild it. But that was a big concern, as people were saying, it doesn't reflect well in the city to have this kind of hulking remnant of this failure, basically, sitting there and, not being used. It kind of indicated that San Francisco wasn't completely, back in business. So, it is interesting to have those reminders and what they kind of what message they're giving to the outside world. But I was actually in San Francisco a few years ago as well, and Hayes Valley is it's such an incredible neighborhood, and it's interesting to think what might have been if that earthquake hadn't happened.
Yeah, and it's one of those, as you've been speaking about with the magazine of the advantage of imagery and pictures, and it's one of those things now. As a first timer to Hayes Valley a few years ago. You couldn't conceive of a double-decker freeway going through the middle of it. So you need to look at a picture and go, oh my God, this lovely urban open space was not this lovely urban open space always. Okay, so we have one last question for you that we ask everybody that comes on the pod. Can you each share a city that you love and why you love it?
Oh my gosh.
I got mine already.
You do?
I do.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Tokyo, for sure.
All right.
It is, I've been there a few times now, and every time I go back, I just remember why it's my favorite is because it is the most surprising city I've ever been to. As the largest city in the world, I would have never imagined it is the most peaceful, relaxing, totally easygoing city I've ever been to. That I go there for, just to unwind, and it's just, I would have never imagined such a immensely scaled city would offer so much just a breath of fresh air, really, because I think they plan their neighborhoods so well because from what I understand, it's a general lack of planning. It's somewhat hands off, and their zoning is not so rigid and fixed. It's more use based, and it's as long as things are somewhat complementary to each other and don't really antagonize one another, sure, do it, and it's just it's shocking for me to go there and recognize that this is such a livable, relaxing, lovely city, and yet it's the population of Canada in one little space. How does this happen? And it's just I love it. It's such a wonderful place.
Amazing. Tokyo and Japan in general, I have yet to go to, and it is the absolute top of my must-go-to list. So thanks for adding to that.
How am I supposed to follow that up? I guess the first place that comes to mind for me is Amsterdam. And I guess it's because I was surprised. I wasn't expecting it to be the way it was. You kind of, you grow up hearing the stories about free and crazy Amsterdam, but that's not what I experienced. My experience was this kind of liberal, tolerant, beautiful, engaged place with, really well laid out with the canals and the bridges but I guess it was more a feeling. I mean, the architecture is stunning, obviously, and the way that the canal architecture evolved is really, really wonderful. But I guess it was more of a feeling that I guess it's one of the only cities I've ever been to where I thought I could stay. Just send my things, and I'm sticking here. And I can't really put my finger on why, but it was one of the only places where I felt that.
The waning days of the 1980s was a dynamic time in many cities around the world. The events explained in this episode give a glimpse into life in 1989 as experienced through triumphs, horrors, and everything in between. And though it may not feel like so long ago, the events that transpired a generation ago is an important part of our global heritage. I appreciate RJ and Megan's passion and critical analysis of heritage planning. Their magazine is really a work of art, so if you'd like to have a more visual understanding of 1989, pick up a copy of the latest Hindsight Magazine. It's sold in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, London, Manchester, Berlin, and Munich. And you can learn more about the magazine and order it online at hindsightmag.com. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go off and listen to some Bobby Brown, Fine Young Cannibals, and maybe some Paula Abdul. 360 Degree City is created by our team at Intelligent Futures. To learn more about the work we do, go to intelligentfutures.ca. I'm John Lewis. Thanks for stopping by.